In a world of busyness and convenience, people cut a lot of corners to save time. We order out more, we text rather than calling, and the list goes on. As someone whose grandmother was a home ec teacher and whose mother was a dietitian, I've been baking from scratch for my whole life. And I didn't learn how rare this is until I came to college. And friends were shocked when I would bring homemade coffee cake, homemade brownies, and homemade cookies places and share them with them. They were just shocked. They couldn't believe I made it from scratch. So today I'm going to show you how to bake chocolate chip cookies from scratch. I'll share tips and tricks to make the preparation and baking simpler and produce a better product, a better tasting cookie, and I'll share the benefits of baking from scratch as opposed to using pre-packaged mixes. First, I'll start with basic preparation of the cookie dough. I have here all that I need to make cookies. I've got my recipe. What I'm using is the Nestle Toll House chocolate chip recipe, which you can find on bags of Nestle chips or just online, which is where I get it. I've got here 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour, and I already mixed in 1 teaspoon of baking soda and 1 teaspoon of salt. I have 2 sticks of softened butter. I have 3/4 cup of regular granulated sugar and a 3/4 cup of packed brown sugar. And I use dark brown sugar. I also have my vanilla extract and 2 eggs. And on top of that, of course, I have my semi-sweet chips. I like semi-sweet better than sweet. I think it tastes a lot better when you're baking, rather than just being overly sweet. And so, of course, then I have my equipment, a mixer, a standing mixer. If you don't have one of these and they're expensive, you can just use just an electric handheld mixer. And I would recommend doing that over just using a fork or something to stir it. I'll tell you about that later. Before we even get into starting the baking and preparing our recipe, there's a few things you need to do even before you start. One of those things, this might take like a couple of hours, you need to take your butter out of the fridge so that it's soft and not like rock hard like it just came out of the fridge. That may take like 2 hours just sitting out on your counter. It doesn't take that long. If you need to microwave it, you can, but sometimes I can just get more than soft and it can just melt, and that's not good. And then you need to start your oven preheating. This recipe calls for the temperature to be 375 degrees, so you just set it to that, and you need it to get to proper temperature before your cookies can cook. So usually it only takes the amount of time that it takes to bake the dough, to prep the dough. So let's start. The recipe first calls to combine the flour, baking soda, and salt, which I already did in an outside bowl. So just 2 1/4 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, and I usually like to add a little less because it doesn't really have a purpose besides taste, and I don't need too much salt in my food. And then 1 teaspoon of baking soda. The next step in the recipe is to beat the butter and the granulated sugar in your mixer. Now what the recipe calls for is for you to cream it, and what that means is that you need to beat it for a few minutes on a high speed. And rather than just mixing it, what creaming does, and this is really important, I think it's the most important part of baking cookies, is that it'll make the consistency different. It'll make the color lighter, so it'll be a lot fluffier and lighter. So then there's your brown sugar, and there's your granulated sugar. And then you also need to add the vanilla to this, and this is my second tip, is that the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of vanilla, and I add a lot more because it tastes a lot better, and it just tastes so much better. So literally when people are shocked I do this, I just kind of glug it in. But trust me, it really tastes a lot better, as long as you don't put it in the whole bottle, like it's going to taste better. Then you get to creaming it. And you'll do this for a few minutes, like I said, so that the consistency will get a lot better. And that'll just make the basis of the dough much better. And it already smells really good. Just the vanilla, like, getting into the air. So now I'll tell you what we're going to do next. We're going to add the eggs, making sure they're beaten really well. And beat in gradually your flour mixture, gradually, so that it doesn't like all poof up when you start the mixer. And this already turned out like a lot lighter and fluffier. It's amazing because you see the color of this versus that color of the dark brown sugar. It's a lot lighter. You scrape it down. And then you add your eggs, beating it well. And one of the things that I find helpful is when you have something like this, like the eggs you need to mix in, and when you have the sugar and whatnot, like the mixer's gonna be running for a second. So sometimes it's helpful to kind of start cleaning up, and you start so that your kitchen's not a complete wreck when you're done, because baking takes a lot of dishes and it takes a lot of time and whatnot, and yeah, it makes your kitchen a lot like more manageable in the end if you've been kind of cleaning up throughout the whole cooking process. So that's done. It's really very easy. And pretty much every time you add a new ingredient, scrape it down. And then we're going to start adding our flour mixture in, which you just start adding it gradually, like I said, so it doesn't poof. So a little bit. Mix it. That's once it's mixed in, you can add some more. And it looks like it's not going to absorb all the flour. It looks like but it really does. It's neat how much the dough expands now. Because the bulk of it's like just made of flour. And you see some of it always kind of poofs out. And that's all there is to it. The last thing is to add your chips in. And you're done using the mixer. I stir in my chips by hand. It's one normal bag or 2 cups. It's a 12-ounce package. This is the standard size at your grocery store. So I mix it in by hand because the force of the mixer, it's just gonna like run right over chips and like smear them to the bottom of your mixing bowl, which makes it harder to clean. The only thing is if you're stirring it in by hand, make sure the chips all get to the bottom so that when you're scooping them out, you don't have a lot of empty dough at the end. So, now we finished our dough. That's it, right? No, there's still a lot more steps left, and I have a few more tricks to share with you. A lot of times people, actually most of the time, unless the recipe calls for it, people will just take their dough and start scooping it onto a pan to bake in the oven. And I don't do that. I found that something that makes your cookies a lot better is if you stick them in the fridge, like this dough, in the fridge or in the freezer if you have less time. I usually just stick it in the freezer. It only takes like 7 minutes. And the dough will harden up because like that butter base is in there and it was so soft, but once you put it in the freezer it gets really hard. And that makes it so that once you put them in that hot oven, they don't melt as quickly. So rather, like you'll have them in a ball of dough. So rather than just like melting, they'll stay solid longer so that they don't spread out as far. That means they'll be thicker and therefore gooier. So that makes them a lot better. Put your dough in the freezer for a few minutes before you start scooping it onto your pan. Then something else I like to do, when your cookies go in the oven and it's at 375, like I said, the recipe calls for 9 to 11 minutes or until they are golden brown. I take them out a little, like just a minute or two before that, when they still look a little bit gooey in the middle, a little wet, versus like cooked like versus the cooked look that they get. They're heated all the way up to temperature. It's just gooier in the middle when I take them out, because once you take them out of the oven, you put them on a cooling rack, and no matter what, when they go on the cooling rack, they're gonna dry off and get harder. So if they're done like really golden brown, they're just gonna get harder and they're gonna turn into like crunchy Chips Ahoy, and no one wants that if you're baking from scratch. You want them to be really gooey and good. So I take them out early, and that drying process takes them from what, like, you look at it and you're like, oh, that might not be completely done, but it is. It just kind of dries out and makes the cookies really gooey and good. Like the best you've ever had. So, I've just explained to you my secrets for baking cookies from scratch. Just real quick, a few benefits of baking from scratch. The first thing is you can make things a lot healthier. Like, for example, with muffins, the recipe calls for oil. You can substitute that entirely for with applesauce, and that's a lot healthier. It tastes the same, just as delicious, and you're saving a lot of fat by using applesauce instead, so it makes things a lot healthier. Another thing you can do for cookies is I use just all-purpose flour, but you can use half whole wheat flour and half all-purpose flour, or like a third whole wheat flour and 2/3 all-purpose flour, and it's whole wheat. Like, it makes that a lot healthier. And I mean, I think if you're using all whole wheat, it might affect the taste a little bit, but if you just use partial whole wheat and partial all-purpose, it just tastes like richer, and it's just a lot healthier for you. Also, something nice, I told you I added a lot less salt than the recipe calls for. So you save a little bit of sodium. You don't have as much sodium in your recipe if you just cut it a little. So all the cookies from like the packages, the prepackaged ones, they have a lot of preservatives and a lot of extra sodium, more than you need. Like, you saw everything that I put in the cookies, it was all pretty, like, fairly natural. It wasn't just, I didn't add, like, all kinds of chemicals to help preserve it, because you don't need to. You're just going to be eating it within the next, couple hours or couple days or whatever. Another nice thing about baking from scratch is that it's a bit of a hobby, so it's just something you can go in the kitchen, you can make something that you're proud of, and you can just kind of slow down and be less busy and just relax. So it's a bit of a hobby. You can experiment, like learning tips and tricks, like the things I come up with your own. And then, finally, it really means a lot to others when you bake from scratch. It impresses them, it tastes better, but it also just shows, it's like, wow, you made this for me. It must have taken a lot of work. It means a lot. So it's very beneficial to cook from scratch for a lot of reasons, to yourself and to others. So to sum up, baking from scratch, as you can see, it's not as hard as you might have thought. I've shared some of my secrets to making perfect chocolate chip cookies, homemade, and I've explained the many reasons that you should bake from scratch too. The one last piece of advice is something that my mom would always say, is that the most important ingredient in baking from scratch is love. Aw, thank you.